My interest in economics started at the age of 18 with a question on fairness. I was taken from middle-class Norway to Peru because we were collecting money. The students were collecting money for building schools in the Andes, and I found that. And I found that all the people I met in Peru, the taxi drivers and the waiters and the people who were cutting my hair, they were equally inefficient as the people back home in Norway. So my question was, I thought it was very simplistic, and I thought when I go home I look it up in a dictionary. And my question is, well, why is it that if a bus driver in Lima who has a job which is much more difficult than the bus driver in Norway, why is his salary only 5% of the bus driver in Norway? So I had an idea from the society that was some kind of hierarchy of skills, right? And people at the same skill level had similar payments. So I didn't find a reply to that. And after exactly 40 years, I had written a book, How Rich Countries Got Rich and Why Poor Countries Stay Poor, and which has now been translated into many languages. And there I tried to give an explanation for this, because I thought this was unfair. You know, I thought that in a fair society, people doing the same things would get equal pay, right? Very simplistic idea, but I guess that's what I had from a very social democratic Norway. By the way, science and art has been together for a long time. Leonardo da Vinci was mentioned. Leonardo didn't only invent flying machines, he also actually constructed irrigation canals that worked, right? And he also made a prototype tank, right? So the interesting thing that art and science early on were in the same person or with a very small group of person. If you take the persons around Leonardo, one of them was Luca Pacioli, who invented, or should we say, codified bookkeeping. You know, what would capitalism have been without bookkeeping? And what's the relationship between bookkeeping and Leonardo da Vinci? Well, one of his close friends. And Alberti, who wrote a book about De la Familia and about the ethics of business in the Renaissance, a job later taken over by Benjamin Franklin on the Way to Wealth, which is the best-selling economic books ever, 1,125 editions before 1850. Nobody's ever heard of it. We see him on the US banknotes. But he wrote The Way to Wealth, which is kind of an ethical view of capitalism. Well, that disappeared. So I'll be trying to recreate a bit of this history. I came back to Peru and worked there and was presented by a Peruvian friend this book from 1970, Un Mundo para Julius, Alfredo Pris Echenique. And this book is about upper-class Lima, the old upper-class Lima, with incredible wealth on the top and a lot of servants. Right? And there was a racial thing there. The servants were from the Andes and were not white, and the upper class was white. The hero in this book, early in the book, he is about 5-6 years old, and his father dies. And his father is carried out, the body of his father is carried out the front door. Then his beloved nanny dies, and they attempt to carry his nanny out the back door. And this young man of 5 makes a fantastic rebellion. You know, he refuses. He becomes, he's so infuriated by this lack of fairness, right? By this unequal treatment of two people who were close to him, right? And I think this is something that will tell us that the idea of fairness is deeply rooted in the human beings, right? And that gives us an idea about what kind of theory should we have of man. And I'm going to say some nasty things about English economics, but I'm going to say some pleasant things about economics, about Englishmen afterwards. So please bear with me. Jeremy Bentham had this idea about man being like a blank slate on which impressions are engraved, and man is an animal seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, right? And that doesn't tell anything about our friend Julius here, right? Then there is a continental story coming out of Naturrecht, of Leibniz and other philosophers, where man is a noble creature working, comparing patterns. So a person's life is like a movie where you observe facts and then you create experience by connecting previously unconnected facts. Right? And this happens to be the historical method of economics, connecting previously unconnected facts. Right? And this is, I think, a natural way of working. The opposite way of working, which is today's mainstream, is that you make models. Right? And those models can become quite introspective. There was a movement by a French economic student, the movement for post-autistic economics, right? Because these models became very autistic. Unfortunately, or fortunately, they lost the name because children of autistic children, didn't like the idea. But there is something to this, that artists observing the world and making abstractions from it in different forms. And I think this is also related to the discussion we had in the beginning, that movements in favor of fairness very often start with the understanding that the world is suboptimal, right? You can actually improve, right? And during the Renaissance, people were traveling to Rome, as they've always done, and they were observing sheep grazing among the wrecked columns of old Rome. And they were thinking, we have actually been better off before. We have been more civilized before. We have to give birth to that again, the rebirth. And I think in the same way we can think today that, well, it's not really necessary that so many children die very young in Africa. And I think the immediate answer to that is that of Bill Gates. Well, give them some vaccination, right? I think that's a very simplistic idea. You're trying to treat the symptoms rather than the causes. And this happens too often. And I therefore also think that it's very dangerous with people who only have good intentions. One case of good intention is Bundeskanzler Kohl, 1991, coming back from Maastricht and saying, well, this project of the euro, to be fair to the poor periphery of Europe, we have to give them also the access to the euro, right? Which was an absolute disastrous idea. We see now in Greece, right? But I think we are too often blended or blinded by good intentions, right? Development aid is very similar. We don't really care if all that money we give destroys the fabric of poor countries. As long as the intention is good, fine. So I think this is we have been through a relatively shallow century, in a sense. And I think what we lost in the 20th century was an understanding of diversity. And this was the result of mass production. Right? Henry Ford said to his salesman, you can have the car in any color you want as long as it's black. Because he had to keep the costs down and he had to standardize production. Well, the same thing happened in China, where everyone was equally dressed. Like, everything was alike. And the culmination of the 20th century was the cloning of a sheep called Dolly, right? Making something, imagine if we could have all sheep in the world identical. Wow, fantastic idea. And you look at nature, and nature kind of gives you another idea. You know, why is there so much diversity? Why are we 7 billion people there all different, right? So there's something, I think we have to come out of the 20th century and into the 21st, and one important thing there is to recognize diversity. And diversity and fairness make things a bit difficult. Just to give you a brief history of economics, I'm trying to tell you why economists are so bad in dealing with fairness, okay? When the rest of the world was discovered, or the rest of the world discovered the European explorers, everybody thought, once we were all America, once we didn't have agriculture either, right? So this gave birth to the idea of stages, and that mankind has been through different stages. The age of hunters, the age of shepherding, the age of pasturage, the age of agriculture, and then comes Adam Smith and creates, age of agriculture, agriculture and manufacturing, and then comes Adam Smith and says, this is the age of commerce. Notice that all the others are what Marx would have called modes of production, right? They're ways of producing. But commerce is something else, right? So from an intuitive point of view, if you had free trade between a manufacturing country and a hunting and gathering tribe, you will understand intuitively that this will not create fairness, this will not create equality, right? But this is a problem with modern trade theory, which is based on the barter of labor hours. So if you are two tribes in the Stone Age, and you see the other tribe on the other side of the river, they go from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age. And then if you think like an economist, you say, well, we seem to have a comparative advantage in the Stone Age, so we should stay there, right? The alternative theory is based on emulation. And if somebody is doing things more clever than you are, you should emulate them. Emulation, the idea of imitating people in order to improve, right? Like children do, you know, first person to the corner and they run, right? Emulation is a very natural thing for human beings. And that instinct of emulation was kind of killed by English economics. The whole idea of comparative advantage founded the basis of the unfairness of colonialism. Because the basis for colonialism was to prohibit manufacturing in the colonies. In 1776, the Americans called that English bluff. 70 years later, the Germans and the Norwegians called that bluff. But Africa never really got around to calling the bluff, right? So notice as the Bronze Age goes into the Iron Age and goes into the Atomic Age or whatnot, the tribe on the one side of the river will always have a comparative advantage in the Stone Age. So they are told by economists to stay in the Stone Age, right? And this is why Africa has never been, but that's why the branch on this tree of life that we heard about, where the African branch is so thin. Some African countries, by accident, got rich, like South Africa and Zimbabwe, because they had apartheid. And because they had apartheid, they were boycotted. And because they were boycotted, they grew their own industry, right? So I was in Georgia last week, and they say, well, can you say, what's the strategy for Georgia? Georgia has lost Tbilisi. Georgia has lost 50% of its real wages since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, what's your short version of a strategy? I would say, well, the short version of a strategy is to force everyone with blue eyes to sit in the back of the bus, because if you do that, you have apartheid and you will be boycotted and you can industrialize again, right? This is the idea that all economic activities are alike comes to economists because they assume David Ricardo's theory that the international economy is based on the barter of labor hours, right? And those labor hours in Ricardo's theory are qualitatively alike. So economists don't say to their children, well, my daughter, you're so good at washing dishes, you obviously have a comparative advantage in washing dishes, so go out and make a career in washing dishes. They don't say that to their children, because with the children, they use intuition, common sense. But in fact, they say that to the children of Africa, right? Go into where there are the least skills, because your comparative advantage is cheap labor. So, unfortunately, the German economics was poured out with the bathing water after World War II, and Americans switched to the English theory once they got rich, right? So this kind of theory dried out. So, just to give you another idea of these stages, just to give you the idea that things go together. Here in the first stages, you have barter. You don't have any money. You have a clan economy, right? And the problem, if you look at Zimbabwe, is that Mr. Mugabe is trying to run that country as if it were a clan economy, right? Favoritism, expropriating the farms of the white, etc., etc. It's pretty obvious. I've been there 3 times in the last 2 years. It's pretty obvious that this is what's going on. So it's not really capitalism. It's a clan economy imposed on a nation, with all the lack of fairness that leads to. And from labor standpoint, slaughter of enemies. Slaughter of enemies is before you understand that your enemies can really be used for slave labor. You don't see that, right? But then when you're more advanced, you see that they can be used for slave labor. Handicraft, you get a town economy, you get the money economy, you get free labor, and you get trade. Then you get to the national economy, and then to the global economy. You go from the money economy to the credit economy. This is actually, somebody saw that in the 1860s, this Mr. Hildebrandt, that it actually, qualitative changes. And these qualitative changes, economics is very bad at. So now we come closer to fairness. But, idea here that industrial revolution, there is the first, there is the second, there is the third, and now there is the fourth. And those who are in the high-tech industries will be the richest. Therefore, the European Union policy for a long time was to make industry survive in all its member nations. Right? So, if you look at these, what income distribution mechanisms there are in these different societies. In the household economy, it's based on what anthropologists call reciprocity. Right? If all people live together in the same village for their whole life, if I build a house, you all come and help me to build the house, and I pay for the food, and when each one of you build a house, I come and you give the food. Right? This is, fairness is relatively easy when everyone lives together in a small village. And of course, this, here you have what Marx will call Urkommunismus, the original communism, that actually you get according to, you give according to your ability and you receive according to need. Right? My wife and I had 2 sons, and one of them had a terrible problem of hypersensitivity and allergy. He went to study in London. He couldn't live in the London smog. We had to find a good university with no air pollution, which is not easy. You know, the only Ivy League university in the US with no air pollution is Cornell. So we sent him to Cornell, right? So obviously that son cost us a lot more than the other son who's studied in polluted Oxford, right? So, but that's fair. You know, both sons understand that that's fair. And this is the urkommunismus, you know, according to need, right? And this is, of course, what the welfare state is all about. The welfare state is a huge insurance system, in a sense, right? And it has provided some kind of it has provided, I think, fairness. Then you get to the town and regional economy. You have the family. You have labor mobility, so you can move to where there is better jobs. And then you get the early insurance schemes. Mutuo Soccorso, which pops up in Florence in the late 1500s, right? You know, you get institutions to handle this fairness. As I say, fairness is to a large extent an insurance scheme. Then you get a national economy, and I say EU until 1989. Then you have all of the above, but you also have the idea which survived from the 19th century that, you know, this is my bus example again, bus driver example. You know, the bus drivers who share their labor market with high tech are much richer. Therefore, it was seen as a job of the European Union to distribute industries to all countries. So if you look at Greece and Portugal and Spain, their biggest growth was actually before they joined the European Union. And when they joined the European Union, there were all kinds of schemes to make sure that manufacturing industries survived in all these countries. You know, tariffs in Spain were brought down by 10% a year. A lot of money to pay to keep the car industry alive, right? Very important as an employer. So this is the national economy based, which was pretty fair, but it was also based on moving economic activities around, making sure that those wage-setting economic activities were distributed in all nations, right? And that worked. Then comes the global economy, and the EU, particularly after 2004. None of the above. You know, the EU doesn't want to be a transfer union, but you get development aid, and you get what one Canadian economist calls welfare colonialism, which is the colonial drain being reversed. The colonial drain used to be out of the colonies and into the mother countries. Now it goes back, and you move people. And here is something I think very important, is we have an option. Either we can move economic activities or we can move people. Because we stopped moving economic activities, because we let industry die out in Greece, we have to move people. Right? Something's got to go, as the Americans say. You could, you know, it would be helpful if you devalued the drachma. You know, when Portugal in the old days had problems when their balance on payments was in deficit, well, the market, the foreign currency market devalued the escudo, right? As it would have devalued the drachma. So now we are in a situation that we no longer move economic activities around, and we have frozen the exchange rate. Right? And I think that is a very important reason for the present problems. You know, I think today we are in a very fortunate situation. Things are getting worse, and my hope is that things will get worse really fast, because then we can get out of things fast. I compare this to 1848. 1846 was the biggest freedom of the biggest victory of free trade. The English stopped protecting their agriculture and tried to convince everyone else to stop protecting their manufacturing industry. And for about a year, that seemed to work. But then there was a massive financial crisis in England in 1847. There was a crop failure from Finland to Spain in 1847 and 1848. And you have revolutions in 1848 in all large European countries except Russia and England. Right? But out of 1848 comes three very different books. Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, which we know. We also have Bruno Hildebrandt, the first of the German historical school. Marx was so radical he had to flee to England. Hildebrandt was so conservative that he had to flee to Switzerland. Right? So these are very diverse people. But they all come out of 1848. They all come out of the crisis. And the third one is the famous liberal John Stuart Mill, who actually recounted on free trade. I'm waiting for somebody to do Mill's job. Mill said, well, we understand that in order to create wealth, in order to create fairness, every country needs a manufacturing industry. So he suggested infant industry protection. You know, the same logic is, well, you don't send your child of 7 out onto the labor market. You don't do that anymore, right? You need some infant industry protection. And you don't let your children out in the labor market until they have some skills. Well, the same thing applies to a nation, right? So if we go back to old economists, many of them are German. My book was translated into German, and at the end of the book, I added a list of 32 economists, German-speaking economists that Germans should read but have forgotten, right? So there is something about this idea of the sheep grazing among the ruins of the capital. You know, the sheep and all these columns all over the place, the marble columns and the sheep grazing. You know, we have a similar situation now, right? And there are things there which have been unlearned that we can pick up. So what we have unlearned is the different, you know, the importance of economic structure. In a hunting and gathering society, 1 to 2 persons per square kilometers. In an agricultural society, there is 40. In industrial society, in Holland, for example, you get to 400 persons per square kilometer. So only nations with large manufacturing sectors are able to feed a large population. And interestingly enough, famines are normally only found in nations specializing in agriculture. That's kind of counterintuitive. So when Eritrea got to 50 persons per square kilometer and was not allowed to industrialize, the population they shed partly came to Holland, and there was no problem in getting them jobs there. But we failed to see this link. And we failed to see that if the EU strategy with Ukraine works like the EU strategy with Latvia, where 20% of the population of Latvia actually left because of deindustrialization, well, 20% of the population of the Ukraine is 8.5 million people. So if the EU succeeds with its kind of integration with the EU, we are creating 8.5 million new refugees. I said this in Brussels last year, and somebody came up the next day and said, well, do we really have to take them in, right? But I think this is the kind of thing that economists don't see anymore. There's an interesting parallel here. Germany, in order to punish Germany after World War II, the Allied decided what's called the Morgenthau Plan to deindustrialize Germany. And then we understood there were some problems, and the old President Herbert Hoover was sent to the United States. And he sent a letter after a couple of months back to the White House and said, well, there's only one problem with a deindustrialized Germany, that there are 25 million people too many. What should we do with them? Should we shoot them, or should we take them somewhere else? If so, where? Right? Where do you put 25 million Germans in 1945? And it took 2 months, and this Morgenthau Plan was converted to the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was to reindustrialize Germany, right? And this is now what we have to do. If we want to stop people coming to Europe, we have to create an economic structure there which makes it possible to make a living, right? So this is, I think this is important. It has to do with it has to do with the problem of Lampedusa, of the problem of all the refugees. There are, according to the United Nations, there are 900 million people out there who don't get enough food every day. You know, we can't take them into we can't take them into Europe, or we can't take them into the United States. And it's kind of, in a sense, it's unfair just to take 1%. You know, like making a lottery. You know, if you make it to Europe, you're saved, but 99% are not saved. And that, in a sense, that's not fair. It's very fair for the ones we save, right? I'm not against that, but I'm saying we're just treating the symptoms of the problem, not the real cause, right? So I think culture, you know, this is fairness by distributing economic activities rather than by distributing income, right? This, I think, is very important. And then you have some national types of fairness. The English have a particular form of fairness, a strong reaction towards not playing cricket. So if you're being treated unfair in England, you can always say, this is not playing cricket, and they will back off. Right? I was once negotiating in International Paint in Birmingham, which had been acquired by an American company. And they had a big contract with my little company. And I said to my English counterpart, it was an American coming to negotiate, because this was big money even to them. And I said to my English counterpart, are we going to negotiate English or American? He said, what do you mean? And I tried to explain. And in the middle of this session, you know, this American was being grossly unfair. And I said, well, this is not playing cricket. And the English had to translate to him what that actually meant. And his reply was, well, who told you that the world is fair anyway? Right? So there are specific cultural fairnesses, which I appreciate a lot. Right? I really appreciate that English fairness. And you can see when the English come together in a war, when they meet in the bomb shelter, right? It's no more class society. Then they're suddenly united. It's strange, but very positive. And then I have something I call Norwegian fairness, which is millimeter fairness. You know, when I was a kid and on Saturday we had one bottle of Coca-Cola to share, right? The measurement to get the same level of Coca-Cola in the two glasses was tremendous. That applies everywhere, I guess, with children. But it's an expression of the idea of fairness, right? Again, right? But Norway is applying that to a larger scale also, because people are so uniform in a way, right? Remember, there were 3 countries that never joined the EU, and they have one thing, and that was Switzerland, Iceland, and Norway. And they have one very important thing in common. They never had feudalism. And feudalism, where 1% of society owned 99% of the land, was a very unfair system, right? So the role of Switzerland, I think especially, to counteract that feudalist culture is important. Problem is, if the population is about the same and behave about the same, this millimeter fairness is not a big problem. When the population is more less homogeneous, of course, it becomes a problem. In the US, fairness is equal opportunity. The idea that everyone comes off the boat in the harbor and they are all alike and they have equal opportunity. Right? In the first generation, that works pretty well. But then, you know, compound the differences take it. But the idea of equal opportunity, I think, is fine. And the Americans, when they saw that this was no longer true, they went into an interesting thing called reverse discrimination, right? Which is, if you are black and apply to medical school, you get in with a lower grade than one who is white. And I think that's a reasonable idea of fairness. You know, it's pretty, you know, the white guy who doesn't get into Harvard Medical School will say it's not fair, but from a societal point of view, you know, it's fair, right? So this is one angle to get the equal opportunity. And Americans are very much into the positive freedoms, right? There are freedoms to and freedoms from. That doesn't work equally well in all languages, but it works well in English. So the freedom to carry a gun should be modified by the freedom from being shot, right? And the freedom to smoke should be balanced with the freedom from inhaling other people's smoke. Right? And there, I think, you know, the Americans are not very good at balancing, you know, from our cultural point of view, I'm saying, yeah? From our cultural point of view, the Americans are not as good as balancing these freedoms to and freedoms from. Then you have what I call Cuban fairness. Freedom from illiteracy and infant mortality. In the early 80s, I spent a lot of time in Miami. And when you come down when you drive from Miami to Key West, you're actually closer to Havana than you are to Miami. And there you get the two radio stations. You know, you have the Cuban radio station saying, Cuba, primer territorio libre de las Americas, and the Americans, you know, the freest country in the world, right? So they have this cacophony of freedoms and fairness, but with very, very different definitions. And if you look at the Cuban fairness, you know, I'm not a communist, but if you look at the data, you know, illiteracy rate and infant mortality are much lower in Cuba than in the United States. So you think, well, isn't it possible for the Americans to get an literacy rate and infant mortality as low as the Cubans? Yeah, they should have the resources. But I think the Cuban fairness is also something and the freedom from, I think, is something you should take into consideration. And of course, if you look at the hierarchy of needs, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the bottom are the freedoms from hunger, freedoms from thirst, you know, etc. Freedom from illness, etc., etc. And then you get the kind of luxury freedoms, the freedoms to, you know, freedom of the press is very important, but if your child is starving, well, you have other things to think about, right? So this is, I guess, what I'm trying to do is following Nietzsche, who has the idea that objectivity is created by seeing a problem from as many angles as possible, right? I think this is a good kind of objectivity, and I'm trying. And then there's a Swiss fairness. The Swiss fairness is actually the absence of arbitrariness. And what is the most typical thing of a feudal society? It's the arbitrariness of the landowner. Today you have a job, tomorrow you don't. When I worked in Italy, the generation above me, if they left the feudal estate, the whole family will be kicked out. Right? One child wanted to study at university, the whole family was kicked out. So this is something which comes out of the anti-feudal tradition. I studied state constitutional law in Switzerland. And my fellow Norwegian students said, you just have to, in order for a foreigner to pass the test, the only thing you really have to know is the prohibition of arbitrariness, the villkorförbud. And I think this is perhaps the most important freedom in my view, the most important tool of fairness. The most important tool of fairness is that people are treated not in an arbitrary way, and there you get into Montesquieu and the balance of powers. You get into John Kenneth Galbraith and the balance of countervailing powers. Perhaps capitalism was at its best when you had a big state, a big labor union, and a big government, a big company, a big state, and a big labor union. Right? U.S. in the 1950s. And I think we lost a lot when the labor unions lost their job, lost their members. And I think if you go into Mr. Piketty and what's the cause of all this inequality, I think James Galbraith is right that he tended to oversee the importance of the labor unions. He tended to forget that. So that's important. And then of course you have the golden rule of fairness, which exists in every religion. I think the only place it doesn't exist is in Ayn Rand's libertarianism. We may have had cultures before, but all the cultures that survived actually follow this rule. And I think this is very important. This is a basic rule. Mahatma Gandhi once said that Jesus was the most important economist of his time, right? So this is what they had in common. And then the golden rule of fairness kind of develops, doesn't it? This is a famous cartoon. Remember the golden rule? Whoever has the gold makes the rules, right? And I think this was early. This was 1972 or something like that. And I think it's very well put. And that is what we're getting into, right? And this is what's breaking down with Brexit. This is what's breaking down with Trump. That the deal between the elite and the people has been broken in a sense. So, Norwegian economist who said, define economics. One of the nice things about economics that it's not only a way of thinking, factual knowledge does not exist. Which I think most people are not aware of that, but it's really like saying, don't disturb us with facts, right? And then you have German philosopher Gadamer. The root of everything we can call theory is to observe things as they are, right? And I think as economists, you can't be with Gadamer on Monday and Tuesday and then shift. I think if you want to get closer to fairness, you have to find again this theory of looking at things the way they are. And there I think science can really mislead you. And Andreas Altelli, who's sitting here, is working on this problem. And I think this used to be a problem in economics. Now this is a problem in many other sciences. So I don't feel so alone anymore, because this is also a problem in other sciences. So if we go back in economic history, we find that private interest was limited. This is Pietro Verri, writing 6 years before Adam Smith. He was from Milan. The private interest of each individual, when it coincides with the public interest, is always the safest guarantor of public happiness. And what happened is that society as a whole was kicked out of economics, so that what is in italics in the middle here disappeared. There is no such thing as society. Margaret Thatcher just restated an assumption of economics, right? So the public interest doesn't exist because there is no such thing as a public. So we have to get back there, I think, right? We have to say, well, this kind of banking is not in the interest of the public. It's not in the public interest. So we have to clean up the system. So this is 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Corporate leaders gather in a field outside there in Connecticut, where one of them claims to have seen the invisible hand of the marketplace. This is really primitivism, isn't it? This is economics as kind of religion. And then we had a similar movement before. The nice things about economics is that it's cyclical. It goes up and down in levels of abstraction. And we have been through a period similar to this one in the late 1800s, in the late 19th century. And here is one economist who attacked the kind of what I would call this introvert economics, and he made fun with economics. But parallel to Mr. Veblen, you also had a forgotten movement within the United States. This is a politician from Alabama, of all places, member of the Senate, writing about American plutocracy. Well, you couldn't write a similar book today. I think it should probably be republished, right? And the mechanisms are similar. So Veblen, he's making fun of Jeremy Bentham and this idea of man seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. The hedonistic conception of a man is that of a lightning calculator of pleasures and pains who oscillates like a homogeneous globule of desire and happiness under the impulse of stimuli that shift him about in the area but leave him intact. He has neither antecedent or consequence. He is an isolated, definitive human datum in stable equilibrium except for the buffets of the impinging forces that displace him in one direction or the other. And he goes on like that. Spiritually, the hedonistic man is not a prime mover. He's not the seat of the process of living, except in the sense that he is a subject to a series of permutations enforced upon him by circumstances external and alien to himself. You know, man's wit and will used to be the driving force of economics. Now it's not, right? And this could be valid today. And this shows, I think, one important arm in favor of fairness. Jonathan Swift didn't like the idea that Irish children were dying from hunger. So he wrote a modest proposal. And the modest proposal was to sell Irish children as food for the English upper classes. And the book comes with recipes how to prepare Irish children for food. Right? I mean, when you get desperate enough, like Swift was, and Veblen was, this irony is a very important weapon, right? And I think here is where art comes in. I mean, this can certainly be expressed in many modes. So think of deep irony as a tool to create more fairness. The contents is that social Darwinism has been a very important force in the United States, together with some degree of anti-intellectualism. And they go poorly together, anti-intellectualism and social Darwinism. So Herbert Spencer was a very important philosopher towards the end of the 19th century, whose idea it was that the rich are only rich because they are more clever and they deserve it, right? So this is, and it's actually Spencer who created the idea of the survival of the fittest, not Darwin. He took the idea from Darwin and turned it into social philosophy. So, and the problem with neoclassical economics is that it also opens up for these kinds of problems. You know, economists assume perfect information. Everyone knows the same. Then I wouldn't have had to stand here, of course, because we would all know the same. And full employment. They have to assume that to get their models to work. But then they come to believe in their own assumptions. And then if people don't have a job, it's very easy to say it's because they're lazy. Well, they may be lazy. But it may also be a lack of jobs, right? So neoclassical economics very easily gets into blaming the victim, right? And blaming the victim, we know from World War II, was a pretty bad idea. It's about the most unfair idea you can come up with, right? And I think therefore it's the job of artists and other social scientists to try to counteract this movement, you know, and therefore it's important that you know the assumptions of economists, and that so you don't think that they must be extremely wise because this mathematics is so inaccessible. You know, you should try to go through and have things explained to separate the good things from the bad things. We've had some increasing unfairness. Free trade in small Latin American countries led to falling wages in the 1980s and 90s. What happened in the United States was that you used to have a fair society because increase in productivity was shared equally as between capital and labor. The French economists call this the Fordist wage regime. If there is a 4% increase in productivity in industry, labor gets 4% wage increase. And, by the way, so does the bus driver. And here's the key. That the wages of the bus drivers go up with the wages of the industrial workers. Right? And for over 100 years, that relationship between capital and labor was very close. And in the 1930s, actually the share of labor rose. So capitalists lost relatively more money in the 1930s than labor did, which is amazing, right? Because they had unions, sorry. But you see, this splits up in 1975, and productivity goes up, and wages stay the same, and Americans go into debt, and you have the usual story. Russia. Russian wages had a shock. Russia had a shock therapy. Wages went down by 50%. Industrial sector went down by 50%. Agricultural production went down by 50%. Not only did they stop producing cars, they also almost stopped producing potatoes. And you see here, this is the exchange rate of the ruble. So somebody was speculating and keeping the ruble very high in order to get their money out of Russia, probably. You know, in order to get as much dollar value out of Russia as possible, the Russian ruble was inflated. You see the curve there. You know, last time I presented this in Moscow, the chairman said, "Well, I think we should send this to the prosecutor's office." But the Russians are not really aware of what hit them. They are not aware of this tremendous deindustrialization. Right? They're worried about the oligarchs and all that, but that's secondary stuff. You know, the real stuff is that they stop producing. So, and we're not coming to grips with that. The Russians, in my view, I've said it to them, you know, they are in a kind of, they're subject to the Stockholm syndrome, that they identified with the people who ruined their economy. I was there last year, and they had invited Jeffrey Sachs, who caused this deindustrialization, as a hero. You know, I think we are not worrying enough about production. Right? And if the opposite of communism is doing nothing, well, then, you know, it doesn't solve the problem. As I say, I was in Tbilisi last week in Georgia, and there finally the Prime Minister is saying, yeah, well, we have to get some manufacturing back. Now I understand that. So it's coming, but slowly. And if we want to understand the Middle East, this is Iran and Iraq GDP per capita. There was once a country called Persia, and Persia had a Shah. And the year after GDP peaked, the Shah left, and it became Iran in a way. So we don't know what the connection is. But look at the fall of the GDP of Iraq. You know, it's fallen from $6,500, almost $7,000 per capita per year, down to 1,000. And this is the last reliable data, really. But you see, that's when we went to war. But of course, the problem started long before that. My youngest son, who studied in America, saw a sign around 2003 in New York, an elderly gentleman holding a sign saying, "Bombing for democracy is like fornicating for virginity." Right? It's counterproductive. Right? And we you know, we're still bombing for democracy. Right? And I think we should get back to the idea that if people move, it's because there are no jobs. And the amount of jobs depends on the economic structure. Well, I guess I should stop. Well, how much time do we have? It till 12:30? So I can. Should we stop now for stop for questions? Yeah, because yeah.